In episode 29 of Inside the 20 by Basement Brewed Fantasy Football, I started doing mock drafts for 12-team PPR leagues, opening up my brain and providing commentary and thoughts and strategy with every single pick, talking players, talking draft strategy, talking roster construction, and a heck of a lot more. You asked for more of it, so then in episode 30, I did another mock draft, but this time from the other end of the draft board, from the 10 spot. But what about the middle of the draft? We have to show the middle of the draft some love, don't we? So today, in episode 31 of Inside the 20 by Basement Brewed Fantasy Football, let's do more of the same. A mock draft from the 6th spot in a 12-team PPR league where I'm going to open up my brain and provide every single thought that's going through it with every single selection. What's up, my friend? It's your boy, Mikey Henninger from Basement Brewed Fantasy Football, and today in this episode 31, we are going to do a mock draft from the 6th spot in a 12-team PPR league. Now, before we dive in, I want to set the ground rules and explain the settings a little bit. Now, I just received the question on LinkedIn, and candidly, I get this question all the time, but the question was, what is your draft strategy for 2024? Quite frankly, there's no answer for that. There's no one answer for that. There's so many different variables that go into play that all factor into what the overall quote-unquote draft strategy is for 2024. Where are you drafting in your draft? Are you in the beginning, the middle, the end? How many teams are in your league? What are the scoring settings? How many of each position do you start? How deep are your benches? There's so many variables, so many factors that go into play when determining a 2024 draft strategy. And quite frankly, when I go into a fantasy football draft, I never, ever, ever force any kind of strategy. Now, what we're going to do today is a 12-team mock draft on Sleeper against 11 CPUs, 11 computers. Now, that said, I personally have done well over 200 best ball drafts over on drafters.com. If you're not familiar with best ball drafts, they're kind of like a mock draft, but there's skin in the game. You're playing against 11 other players with prizes on the line. And because I've done well over 200 drafts, I can probably give you a hint and tell you right now that I can already picture how this draft is going to go just based on the 2024 fantasy football landscape. And more often than not, I'd say 9 out of every 10 drafts that I do, I'm usually walking out of round 6 with 1, maybe 2 running backs, 4-ish wide receivers, and maybe 1 tight end. Now, I'm not going to guarantee that's how this draft is going to go because I let the draft come to me. I let the draft board come to me. So the answer to the question, what is your overall draft strategy for 2024? The first part of that answer is there is no draft strategy. It's let the board come to me. Don't force any particular strategy. Don't go into a draft saying, I'm going to take a running back in this round. I'm going to take a running back in that round. I'm going to take a wide receiver here, wide receiver there. I know a lot of fantasy football players, and one of the biggest mistakes I see them make is panicking and tricking themselves into reaching for players way too soon because they're scared of missing out or not being able to fill a position. We're going to cover those things in today's episode. Really, what you need to do is draft as much value as you possibly can with every single selection and trust that along the way, during the course of the season, that you're going to be able to dominate the waiver wire. You're going to be able to make some crafty trades. Okay? So, again, the answer to the question, what's the draft strategy? Your number one strategy should just be getting as much value as you possibly can out of every single pick. But I will tell you, like I said, 9 out of every 10 drafts that I've done in 2024, they tend to be largely wide receiver heavy in the front end because what you're going to find in today's episode is that the first 4 or 5 rounds are generally loaded with difference-making wide receivers, where rounds, let's just say 5 to 9, tend to be loaded with high-impact, valuable running backs. So it makes it really easy in 2024 to go wide receiver heavy to begin with, followed by several running backs in the next several rounds. Again, it might not play out that way, But more often than not, that's likely what we're going to see. All right, let's get this party started. We're going to be drafting from the 6th spot in a 12-team PPR league. Now, I set this thing up to reflect what the majority of fantasy football players play in these days, which is leagues that start 1 quarterback, 2 running backs, 3 wide receivers, 1 tight end, 1 flex, 1 kicker, 1 defense, and then there's 5 bench spots, okay? So we're going to be going about 15 rounds in today's draft, in today's episode. Now, throughout this draft and throughout this episode, I am going to be using Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's draft guide, the 2024 draft guide. This is something I update literally every single week, so it's always fresh no matter when your draft is, and it's the resource that 300 plus subscribers are using to outsmart their friends, dominate their drafts, and get the competitive advantage before that first football is even kicked in a couple weeks in week 1. Now, the draft guide comes with tiers that help you plan ahead. It comes with rankings to help you conquer those difficult decisions where you just can't decide between 2 guys. It's going to give you 2024 analysis, 2024 previews of literally every single player. All you got to do is double click on their name and it's going to tell you exactly what to expect from that player in the upcoming season, and several other features that we'll talk about as this episode goes on. Now, for this draft, we are drafting from the 6th spot. So we're going to want to change our next pick to number 6 and our overall draft spot here to number 6 as well. Now you'll see right here, total teams in league. This will work for a 10-team league. It's going to work for a 16-team league. There's a lot that you can do with the draft guide, but we want to make sure everything is correct. This is a 12-team league. We're drafting from the 6th spot, and our next pick is number 6. Now, when I change those things, you're going to see over on the right side our handy-dandy upcoming picks tracker so that it's an easy reminder, easy for you to remember which picks are next for you after this pick. This tells us that after pick 6, our next pick is 19, and then 30, and then 43, and then 54, 67, etc. And that's really helpful to know if you want to do some future planning and future preparation, because Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's draft guide also comes with this ADP tracker. This is something I update every single week, so it's always fresh, but this will give you an idea of where a player that you're targeting generally goes in the majority of fantasy football drafts in 12-team leagues in 2024. So for example, let's just grab any random name. Let's say Kyle Pitts is somebody that you absolutely want to target in your 2024 fantasy football draft. You're going to see that his average draft position in the majority of drafts is usually around pick 60. So it's really, really helpful to know that your upcoming picks in that range are picks 54 and 67. So that way you're not reaching and drafting Kyle Pitts way too soon, but you're also not running the risk of waiting way too long. Okay, now let's get this party started. Let's start this draft. Having done so many, over 200 drafts already this year, I can all but guarantee we're going to be faced with a difficult decision right off the bat. We're most likely going to be stuck choosing between 2 running backs, between Bijan Robinson and Breece Hall, or 2 wide receivers between Amon-Ra St. Brown and Justin Jefferson. The likely first 4 will be Christian McCaffrey, Tyreek Hill, CeeDee Lamb, and Jamar Chase in some order. We'll have to see what's available to us at 6. That decision is going to influence what happens over the rest of this draft. As predicted, the main 4 went off the board first. CeeDee Lamb, Tyreek Hill, Christian McCaffrey, Jamar Chase, and then Bijan Robinson went number 5. And now, like we thought, we are faced with a very, very difficult decision, which is one that I feel the majority of pick 6 and pick 7 drafters will run into in 2024. The question is, do we go running back with Breece Hall, who's a very, very legitimate candidate to finish as the number 1 running back in all of fantasy football in 2024, or do we go with wide receiver? Usually this pick is spent on a guy like Amon-Ra St. Brown, a guy like Justin Jefferson, and indeed, when you reference my 2024 fantasy football draft guide, you'll see that we have 4 players in this tier. Amon-Ra, Breece Hall, Justin Jefferson, but also A.J. Brown, who I feel is being drafted a little bit too low in 2024. Now, to me, the question is the best available wide receiver, which is Amon-Ra St. Brown, or Breece Hall. Now, really quickly, the reason I have eliminated Justin Jefferson from this equation, this is something that I actually was just talking about with one of BBFF subscribers just the other day in our Discord server, which is an online community of 167 and counting fantasy football players that are helping each other dominate, helping each other make decisions just like this one. Now, the hesitation with Justin Jefferson is that he is entering a whole new era with a whole new quarterback. There's no way to sugarcoat it. There's no way to slice it. Losing Kirk Cousins and going from Kirk Cousins to Sam Darnold / JJ McCarthy, there's no way to view that as an upgrade. If anything, it's a downgrade, and more likely than not, it's a downgrade. Now, I like Sam Darnold. He's capable of delivering his guys the ball. JJ McCarthy profiles as the type of quarterback who profiles as the type that can get his guy the ball. But there's no way of sugarcoating it. Justin Jefferson's 2024 environment is not as exciting as his 2021, 2022, 2023 environment. Meanwhile, you got Amon-Ra St. Brown, who's in that Detroit Lions offense that only is trending in the right direction. It's a high-powered offense. It's one of the best offenses in the NFL. Amon-Ra last year scored 15 or more PPR points in about 90% of his games. There were 2 games where Amon-Ra St. Brown did not finish with 15 or more PPR points. He scored 15 or more in 17 of 19 games that he played last year. And given that this is a PPR league and Amon-Ra St. Brown averaged 10-plus targets and 7-plus catches per game last year, he is the choice over Justin Jefferson if I'm choose to flip that coin between the two of them. And indeed, you can see I do have Amon-Ra St. Brown ranked 6th overall and Justin Jefferson ranked 9th overall. Now, the decision is Amon-Ra St. Brown versus Breece Hall. And I want to make it crystal clear here. There is not a wrong answer to this question. You can't go wrong with this pick. If you go Breece Hall, I'm not going to argue. If you go Amon-Ra St. Brown, I'm not going to argue. Now, I am going to be going with the top-ranked player in Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's draft guide. Again, that's kind of what the rankings are for, to help you make those tough decisions. But I'm not drafting Amon-Ra just because he's the number 1 ranked player in my draft guide. I'm drafting Amon-Ra because I know from doing 200-plus drafts this year, real drafts, best ball drafts against other fantasy football players, that the first several rounds of fantasy football drafts tend to be packed with difference-making wide receivers, where the next batch of rounds 5 to 9, tend to be filled with valuable running backs that you can fill your roster out with. The other piece of that, too, is assuming I'm playing in a league that allows for trading and waiver wire activity, I'm much more likely to, when in a tiebreaker scenario and trying to decide between 2 guys, I'm much more likely to lean towards the wide receiver, because running backs are so much easier to replace in fantasy football just by being active and just by paying attention and just by manipulating the waiver wire and adds and drops during the season. As injuries inevitably strike, bye weeks begin, there's always seems to be a supply of running backs that you can plug and play off of the waiver wire. Whereas losing a guy like Amon-Ra St. Brown, I'm not going to be able to just pick up, well, Jameson Williams won't even be an option, but I won't be able to just pick up Khalif Raymond and expect him to get even 50% of the production that I'm going to get out of Amon-Ra St. Brown. So TLDR, the point is, running backs, easier to replace. You can at least get a percentage of their production by next man up in that rotation, whereas wide receivers, losing a guy is not at all as easy to replace that production as it is at running back. So I tend to lean wide receivers because I want guys that are going to be in my lineup every single week as much as possible. Not to mention that wide receivers themselves are less, let's just call it prone. I hate that word. Wide receivers are less exposed to injuries than running backs are throughout the course of the season. So I'm going Amon-Ra St. Brown with this choice, but again, I will not argue with anybody who chooses Breece Hall here. Are you a software wizard? A code ninja? A forge master? Or maybe even just a mad scientist? Then come build your career ladder with Infinity Labs, an award-winning technology company, best place to work, and business of the year with best-in-class benefits and compensation. Visit i-labs.tech. That's i-labs.tech today, where you can learn more about Infinity Labs, our expanding national presence, and why the status quo has no hold on us. Alrighty, we are back on the clock in the second round. This is pick, 19 overall. Now, after I chose Amon-Ra St. Brown, if you're listening on podcast and you can't see the screen, the selections went Justin Jefferson, A.J. Brown, Breece Hall, Puka Nacua, Jonathan Taylor, and Jahmyr Gibbs. That rounded out the first round. Then, to start round 2, it went Garrett Wilson, Devontae Adams, Drake London, Saquon Barkley, Kyren Williams, and Marvin Harrison. Now, this decision is not going to be a hard one. This is going to be a very easy one. I am going to be taking the best available player in the best available tier in Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's draft guide, which I've already updated to delete all those players that were already selected. And if you can see here on the screen, that player is Chris Olave. He's literally the only remaining player in the best available tier. It's a pretty easy decision. Now, I do want to touch on one thing. It's possible you're there saying, we went wide receiver in the first round. Maybe we should get our first running back. I hear you. One of the biggest mistakes that I see fantasy football players make is panicking and reaching for specific positions just because they're scared of not being able to fill out their lineup. Take a deep breath. It's all going to be okay. If your league allows waivers, if your league allows trades, understand that the players that you draft right now are not necessarily going to be the same players that are in your lineup in week 8. Injuries happen, bye weeks happen, busts happen, steals happen, where guys come out of nowhere, cough, cough, Puka Nacua, Kyren Williams. So don't panic. Don't force yourself into drafting a position just because you see other competitors doing it or just because you're scared of missing out. Now, obviously, don't wait too long. You have to put somebody at running back. You have to put somebody at quarterback. But don't force yourself into a running back here just because you took a wide receiver in the first round. Don't go into any round saying, I need to take this position. Now, the other thing is, if we did take a running back, the best available running back in the draft guide is Derrick Henry. And anybody who's listened to any of my episodes or anybody who's in our Discord server or reads my blogs or my posts, they know I am absolutely in love with Derrick Henry as a Baltimore Raven. More than anybody I know. I don't know anybody who's banging the table for Derrick Henry more than I am in 2024. So yeah, I want Derrick Henry on my roster. I want him on every single fantasy football roster I can handle in 2024. But we are not going to take him here. And here's why. One of the other big mistakes that I see fantasy football players make every single year is that they fall in love with certain players so much that they leave value on the table because they force themselves to go get that player because they really, really, really want to have them on their roster. Okay? So, like I said, there's nobody that I know that's banging the table for Derrick Henry more than I am. So theoretically, it wouldn't surprise anybody if I'm the one who's like, I got to get Derrick Henry in round 2 to make sure that I get him on my team. But the reason that Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's draft guide offers the ADP column and offers the upcoming picks column and offers the draft column is to help you identify the perfect time to draft that player. So in this case, Derrick Henry's average draft position, which again is updated every week, so it's always fresh, his average draft position is around pick 30, and we are on pick 19, and our next pick is, you guessed it, pick 30, meaning there's a very good chance that Derrick Henry is still going to be available, and we can draft a stud here and still get Derrick Henry with our next pick. And that's why when you look at the draft guide and you see this big red box that says wait, the draft guide is recommending waiting on Derrick Henry because it recognizes there's a chance we'll be able to get Derrick Henry at pick 30. So again, this is going to be an easy selection. I'm just going to take the best available player in the best available tier. And right now, Chris Olave is in the tier all by himself. There's nobody else to even choose from. He is going to be the pick here. Let me just make the pick and we'll move on. By the way, if you're planning to do mock drafts in order to prepare for your 2024 fantasy football drafts, might I recommend that instead you give Best Ball a try over on drafters.com. Now, Best Ball, if you're not familiar, is a lot like a mock draft in that there's quite literally nothing you can do with your lineup after the draft. You can't set a lineup, you can't add players, drop players, trade players, nothing. You just draft a team, and every single week you're awarded the points of whatever your optimal lineup would have been for that week. And over on drafters.com, they have contests that you can play for as low as $1. You can do a slow draft, which allows up to 8 hours per pick, or you can do a fast draft, which is just 30 seconds per pick. But it's much better, much more effective than doing a mock mock draft because you're playing against 11 other fantasy football players, and it doesn't hurt that there's prizes to be won for anybody who's successful. Now, if you want to give drafters.com a try, use promo code BBFF when you're making your first deposit up to $100, because Drafters is going to 100% match that first deposit. It's like you get a free $100 bill to play fantasy football with. And by the way, if you want to know why I'm bullish on Chris Olave in 2024 fantasy football, simply refer back to episode 5 of Inside the 20, where I talked about Clint Kubiak becoming the offensive coordinator of the New Orleans Saints. The guy has a documented history of success with wide receivers, so give that episode a look. Or, of course, you could just get Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's draft guide and read Chris Olave's note, which says, former 11th overall pick entering age 24 season and year 3 in the NFL, which, by the way, is a common breakout year for young wide receivers in the NFL. He was Fantasy's number 23 wide receiver in 2022. He was the wide receiver 24 last year, and he's potentially primed for liftoff under new offensive coordinator Clint Kubiak. Again, check out episode 5 for more details on what Clint Kubiak has done for his wide receivers, and you'll know exactly why I'm all about Chris Olave in 2024 fantasy football. All right, we are officially back on the clock in the third round. That makes this pick number 30, which we were talking about with Derrick Henry. Now, Derrick Henry's gone. He's off the board. He went 25 overall. In fact, after I chose Chris Olave, if you're listening on podcast, not on YouTube, the picks after I took Chris Olave went Brandon Ayuk, Travis Etienne, Sam Laporta, Josh Allen, and Devon Achane to round out round 2. And then to start round 3, we went Derrick Henry, Travis Kelce, Nico Collins, Mike Evans, Josh Jacobs, and we're back on the clock with pick number 30. Now, here are the options. We could go quarterback, which best available would be Jalen Hurts, Patrick Mahomes, Lamar Jackson, etc. Candidly, this is much, much too early for me to even consider a quarterback, especially knowing after doing 200-plus drafts that I can get an MVP caliber talent like Joe Burrow, Dak Prescott, Kyler Murray, Jordan Love. I can get those guys usually around pick 7th, 8th, 9th round. So, as you can see here in Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's draft guide, quarterback's not even on our radar until about pick 49, and this is pick 30. So quarterback, not an option, even though they're starting to be suggested here on Sleeper, which is sorted by their own ADP. We could also go tight end. And candidly, if Sam Laporta and Travis Kelce were on the board, they would at least catch my attention for a second, but both of those guys are off the board. And the next batch of tight ends, which is Mark Andrews, Trey McBride, Dalton Kincaid, that batch of tight ends, those are guys I won't consider until the 4th round or later. And again, looking at Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's draft guide, Mark Andrews pops up at pick number 45 overall. We're not even thinking tight end. We're not thinking quarterback. Once again, this decision is going to come down to running back versus wide receiver. Now, the best available running back, according to Sleeper and according to Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's draft guide, we agree on this, it's Isaiah Pacheco. And I like Isaiah Pacheco a lot in 2024. I think he's going to, as long as he stays healthy, he's geared up for the best year of his career. There's no way around that. There's no reason to doubt that. Now, that said, if I'm forced to choose between Isaiah Pacheco, who's in my next best available tier, or the 3 guys that are in my best available tier right now, which are Deebo Samuel, Cooper Kupp, and Jalen Waddle, Isaiah Pacheco is automatically eliminated when I have the option to get one of those 3. So the decision comes down to Deebo, Cooper Kupp, or Jalen Waddle, and once again, this is one of those decisions that you just can't quite get wrong. Now, if you listened or if you haven't listened, feel free to press pause and let's go back to episode 28 of Inside the 20, where I did a 49ers specific preview for 2024 fantasy football. And in that episode, I gushed all about Deebo Samuel being a value pick in 2024 fantasy football. And now, when you consider the Brandon Ayuk trade rumors, if you look at Deebo Samuel's splits with and without Brandon Ayuk, Deebo Samuel is an absolute league winner in games where Brandon Ayuk is out of the picture. Again, you can go back and listen to episode 28 or watch episode 28 for more details on Deebo Samuel specifically, or of course, Feel free to read Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's draft guide, the analysis, the preview, all of the bullets that I put in here that explain why I'm bullish on Deebo Samuel. You'll also see in the draft guide that it is starting to recommend him in the draft column in white as a steal, meaning he is usually drafted around pick 19, and we're staring at him at pick 30. He is becoming an absolute steal in this fantasy football draft, usually on smart websites like Drafters and Underdog, you can't get Deebo Samuel outside of the second round. So to me, there's not really too much reason to overthink this one. Deebo Samuel is going to be the pick. Yes, I understand he's going to be our third wide receiver, and we do not have a running back. Trust the process, stay calm, we'll get that part figured out as we go. With week 1 just around the corner, you're about to spend the next 4 months or so making critical decisions every single week, oftentimes decisions that mean the difference between winning and losing your fantasy football matchups and your fantasy football championship. Which player should I draft? Should I add this player? Should I drop that player? Which player should I start? Which player should I leave on my bench? Should I do this trade? Critical decisions that often mean the difference between winning or losing, and you likely don't have anybody reliable to turn to, because your friends are probably the people you're competing against in your fantasy football leagues. But what if you had an army of 166 and counting other sharp fantasy football players that are dedicated to helping each other conquer those difficult decisions and dominate their leagues? That's exactly what you get if you join Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's Discord server, which, by the way, is also where I am hanging out 24/7, 365, dropping exclusive fantasy football insights for my subscribers the very second that I find them. Come hang out with me this fantasy football season. You can join us using the link that we left for you in the show notes below. All right, we are back on the clock in the 4th round, and my mouth is watering. I'm absolutely drooling. I'm foaming at the mouth. So after I took Deebo Samuel, for those of you listening on podcast, it went Isaiah Pacheco immediately after Deebo Samuel, Stephon Diggs, Michael Pittman, Patrick Mahomes, Jalen Waddle, and DJ Moore. That finished up round 3. To start round 4, it went Rachaad White, Jalen Hurts, Cooper Kupp, Trey McBride, CJ Stroud, and Lamar Jackson. Now, if you want to know the secret or the key ingredient to dominating and obliterating a fantasy football draft, it's extracting value out of as many picks as you possibly can. And in this case, why I mentioned my mouth is watering and I'm basically foaming at the mouth here, is that after updating Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's draft guide, we have 4 players in the best remaining tier, all of which have officially become steals in this fantasy football draft, because these are guys that are usually drafted between picks 26 and 33, and we are in pick 43. Devontae Smith usually goes in the early 3rd round of competitive best ball drafts. DK Metcalf usually goes in the early 3rd round of competitive best ball drafts. Malik Neighbors usually goes in the early 3rd round of competitive best ball drafts. Okay, so yeah, this entire tier, this best available tier, is all wide receivers. In fact, if you look at the draft guide, we are going to be swimming in a sea of best available wide receivers, but we also have not filled our flex spot yet. And if you give me an opportunity to take a guy like Devontae Smith, who's usually drafted in the early 3rd round of a fantasy football draft, and now you're giving me a chance to take him in the middle of the 4th round, I'm taking that all day. And again, I understand we don't have a quarterback, a running back, or tight ends yet, but again, take a deep breath, trust the process. I promise you, everything is going to turn out okay. Just keep watching this episode and you'll see how things shake out. If you want to choose between Devontae Smith, DK Metcalf, Malik Neighbors, Michael Pittman, again, everything is ranked for you top to bottom, so you know who I'm choosing when trying to split hairs between those guys. Or, of course, you can always just click open on Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's draft guide. You can click open the player analysis, the player note, the player preview for every single player. But for me, this one's going to be Devontae Smith. We are back on the clock. This is now the 5th round, pick 54 overall, and things have gone better than I could have even hoped for when I pressed start on this entire episode. We have already locked up the best wide receiver room in this 12-team draft. Okay, we have 4 different guys who usually never are drafted later than the early 3rd round of competitive best ball drafts. We have 4 guys that will all give you their fair share of top 12 wide receiver weeks in 2024. Amon-Ra St. Brown, Chris Olave, Deebo Samuel, Devontae Smith. Now, this is especially exciting because you start 3 wide receivers in this league, plus a flex, meaning wide receivers alone can take up 40% of your starting lineup. Okay, at least 30% of all 12 teams' starting lineups is going to consist of wide receivers, and now you just locked up the best wide receiver room in this entire draft class. Now, I recognize the heartburn of entering round 5 without a single running back, right? Running backs have this pedestal that they stand on in fantasy football because, let's be clear, having a Christian McCaffrey is a cheat code to winning a fantasy football championship. Now, there's not many Christian McCaffreys, but still, because of that, running backs are always on a pedestal. You think about LaDainian Tomlinson, you think about Adrian Peterson, Christian McCaffrey, all these guys that were league-winning, almost on their own, fantasy football assets. So people automatically have a tendency to think, I need running backs, man. I got to get those running backs. Obviously, you need running backs. You got to put somebody in your lineup. But I mentioned to you earlier in this episode that after round 4, you start to hit a stretch of a good 3 or 4 rounds of quality, solid running backs that you can slide into your lineup. No, they're not Christian McCaffrey. But when you already have secured a wide receiver room that makes up 40% of your starting lineup, and now you can backfill that with quality RB2 options that have RB1 upside, that is the key to dominating fantasy football in 2024 fantasy football drafts. And case and point right here, right now, look at the number 2 best available name in Sleeper's current draft list when you sort it by ADP. We're talking about a guy that has 75 or more catches in 5 of 7 seasons that he's been in the NFL in a PPR league. We're talking about getting Alvin Kamara, a guy who his whole career spent the majority of his career being drafted in the 1st round of fantasy football leagues. So we've locked up the best wide receiver room in the draft class, and now we're going to go get Alvin Kamara, a PPR monster in a PPR league, our RB1, even though we're taking him in round 5. Couldn't get any better than that. Want to compete against me in a fantasy football league where you can win up to $50,000? Is that nope, not a typo. That is, you heard me correctly, $50,000. I'm partnering up with Full-Time Fantasy and Circa, and I am hosting the Fantasy Football Championships. It's a 12-team PPR redraft league with up to $2,500 worth of prizes in our 12-team league alone. But the top 4 scorers from our 12-team league automatically advance to Circa's grand prize round, where there's $75,000 worth of prizes, including a $50,000 cash prize for the grand prize winner in the grand prize round. It costs $349 to play, and I am taking the next 7 participants on a first-come, first-served basis. The league is almost about halfway full, and I'm looking for the next 7. So come play fantasy football with me using the link that we left for you in the show notes. All right, we are back on the clock in the 6th round. This is pick number 67 overall, and we do have a little bit of a decision to make here. Now, if you flip over to Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's draft guide, you're going to see that the next 7 best available players are wide receivers, including some absolute steals at this point. The topmost being Terry McLaurin. Okay, Terry McLaurin in competitive best ball drafts usually goes in the 4th round, and we're staring at him 2 rounds later in the middle of the 6th round. Now, there's 2 different trains of thought, and neither one of these is particularly right or wrong. So the first train of thought, not necessarily in any specific order, but the first train of thought would be extracting maximum value, which in this case would be Terry McLaurin. Terry McLaurin should not be available, but he is. We have 4 wide receivers already. We spent our very first 4 picks on wide receiver in this draft, meaning one thing we talk about in Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's Discord server is draft like you're right, meaning we spent premium picks, our very first picks, 4 picks on wide receivers. We should assume that those guys are going to be in our lineup every single week because of the investment that we made on them. Otherwise, why would we spend that expensive draft capital on wide receivers? So if Amon-Ra St. Brown, Chris Olave, Deebo Samuel, and Devontae Smith are all going to be locked in our lineup, that effectively makes Terry McLaurin pretty much useless. He would be my first bench player. There's nowhere to put him except for the occasional bye weeks for these guys. Now, what we could do if we drafted Terry McLaurin is follow the philosophy of drafting for value and trading for need, meaning we could take a flyer on Terry McLaurin here if we feel confident that we would have an opportunity to trade him for a running back, a quarterback, or a tight end that is more valuable than anything that is currently on the board here. So, if you know your league mates and it's a trade-heavy league and you feel confident that you could use Terry McLaurin in a package to get a trade, there's some validity to taking them here. There's always an argument for taking the best player available, taking the maximum value, and in this case, that would be Terry McLaurin. If you're in if you're in a league that doesn't trade very heavy and you think it'll be difficult to make a trade, it's okay to skip here because you already have 40% of your starting lineup, 50% of your starting lineup locked up, and it's okay to continue to backfill the need somewhere else, which is the route that we're going to take here. I mentioned to you that we're entering a stretch of rounds that are filled with quality running backs that carry RB1, top 10 RB1 type of upside. Okay? So in this case, you flip over to Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's draft guide. Oh, and the other thing before we even talk about the running backs is that several of these guys in several of these wide receivers that are still remaining, guys like Marquise Brown, Christian Watson, Calvin Ridley, those are guys that, according to Sleeper's ADP, and again, I've mentioned this in previous episodes, always pay attention to the ADP of the platform that you're playing on, because that ADP might manipulate the way that your opponents when they draft the players that they draft. And according to Sleeper's ADP, I'm able to get Calvin Ridley and Hollywood Brown past my next selection in the 7th round. So that makes it easier for me to stomach the thought of passing on somebody like Terry McLaurin if I can still get a Marquise Brown, who I have ranked neck and neck. If I can get Hollywood Brown in the next round, it makes it easier to stomach passing on Terry McLaurin. So, in this case, we are looking at the running backs that are available because we're still looking for our number 2. Now, to be clear, the guy that I take here won't necessarily be my quote-unquote every week RB2. I'm going to be using my heat map, which is something you're going to see me reference. You're going to hear me talk about. It's my differentiator. It's my, I don't want to say claim to fame. That sounds like I'm the opposite of famous. But it is the tool that started this entire business. It's something I used to put on Reddit for free. It exploded, it blew up, and it's basically what started this entire thing. I'm going to be using that heat map to make my decisions at RB2. But we still need to start stocking up that position so we have options that we can rely on in the coming weeks. And according to Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's draft guide, we're looking at Aaron Jones, DeAndre Swift, Najee Harris, Zamir White, so on and so forth. Now, Najee Harris and Zamir White have been eliminated from this conversation because, once again, if you consider Sleeper's ADP, both of those guys, Najee Harris gets drafted around pick 79, which is my next pick is 78. And Zamir White gets drafted around pick 81 on Sleeper, and my next pick, again, is around 78. Meaning, if I pass on Najee Harris and Zamir White here, there's a very good chance that both guys will be available with my next pick. Now, whether or not I take them, we don't know the answer to that yet, but there's a chance that I can get both of those guys. Meaning, I am down to Aaron Jones versus DeAndre Swift. And of course, if you're trying to decide between the two, you can always come in, click open their notes, and decide which one you like better. In this case, I am going to double check bye weeks and things like that to see if there's an obvious tiebreaker. But otherwise, I'm just going to go Aaron Jones, who could be one of the offensive weapons for the offensive engines for the Minnesota Vikings here in 2024. Speaking of making trades, Justin, who is a Basement Brewed Fantasy Football subscriber, he's a very active member in our online community and in our Discord server. He recently wanted to know, does anyone use a site for fantasy football trade grading? And there's two answers to this. Number one, I personally do not use any sort of website or any sort of trade calculator when trying to make my own trades. For one, those trade calculators are great, but they're going off of algorithm, they're going off of a point system, they're going off of numbers and scoring. They don't factor in your league settings or your competition or your current roster or any of those things. Instead, I just lean on Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's Discord server. Again, this is an online community of 166 and counting fantasy football players who are in here dedicated to helping each other make these really, really, really difficult decisions, just like this one. Do I do this trade? Should I not do this trade? Why? There's 166 plus fantasy football players in here helping each other out. You can offer plenty of context. You can tell them about your team league, your scoring settings, everything, and you're going to get very talented fantasy football players helping you out. Now, the one thing I will say about trade calculators, that in a way that I do use them, is that I like to figure out what trade calculators my opponents are using. The 11 other guys in my league, I want to know what trade calculators they prefer to use, that they like to use, because once I know the trade calculators that they like, I am able to go into that trade calculator, craft a trade that I personally like for myself, and as long as the score benefits them, as long as it gives them a better grade for that trade, and gives them a better chance of taking it because the trade calculator says they like their side, that's a no-brainer for me. There's a lot of fantasy football players that look at these trade calculators like they're gospel or like they're the Bible, and if they have a better score of what they're getting in return than the score of what they're giving away, if the trade calculator says that they win that trade, a lot of fantasy football players are going to take that trade. So I want to figure out what my competition likes to use, put together a trade that their trade calculator likes, and that way it feels like it's a win-win because I'm getting a trade that I feel good about, and they're getting a trade that the calculator says that they did well on. We are back on the clock. This is round 7. We are now on pick 78. Now, we are reaching a point in the draft where we're reaching the end of the quarterbacks that I consider to be every week quarterbacks, meaning guys you'll put out every week without thinking twice about it. The last remaining quarterbacks in that batch are Dak Prescott, Kyler Murray, and Jordan Love, maybe Brock Purdy. Brock Purdy belongs in that conversation as well. But after that, there's not any quarterbacks that I would feel comfortable saying, yes, this is going to be the quarterback that I use every single week for the remainder of the year. So, that being said, that automatically puts quarterbacks on my radar. And when you look at Sleeper's ADP, you'll see that they're recommending Dak Prescott's their best available player according to Sleeper's ADP. Kyler Murray is projected to get drafted before my next pick. Jordan Love is projected to get drafted before my next pick. And that would be effectively basically the end of the every week QB1s, which puts a little bit of pressure on me in this spot to draft a quarterback. But you'll notice that each of the 6 teams that follow me with this pick, all 6 of those teams already have a quarterback. Team 7 has Lamar Jackson. Team 8 has CJ Stroud. Team 9 has Joe Burrow. Team 10 has Patrick Mahomes. Team 11 has Jalen Hurts. And Team 12 has Anthony Richardson. All 6 teams that follow me have spent one of their top 6 draft picks on a quarterback. And if they were to select a second quarterback here, I would basically just thank them for their donation to the league, because that is terrible draft strategy, roster maintenance, roster construction, whatever you want to call it. One of them selecting a second quarterback would be devastating for their own team, meaning there's a very good chance I could just skip quarterback here one more round and get Dak Prescott, Kyler Murray, or Jordan Love and feel completely good about it. And even if I don't get one of those guys, I'm more than happy trying to take a flyer on Brock Purdy later. Tua Tagovailoa is a fantasy football weapon. So I'm going to eliminate quarterback from this decision, even though it's possible I get caught without one in round 8. Now, we also don't have one of the bigger mistakes that I see fantasy football players make is thinking that they need to fill out a lineup before they even think about their bench. And what I mean by that is the empty spots on our roster. If you look over here, we don't have a quarterback, which we've already talked about, and we don't have a tight end. So most fantasy football players in their brain might say, okay, if we're not going to go quarterback, then we have to go tight end. That's the spot we don't have. If we take another running back, if we take another wide receiver, that's going to be on our bench. That doesn't really help. So we should take a tight end, theoretically. Now, the best available tight ends are Brock Bowers and David Njoku and Jake Ferguson. Those are the guys that are best available according to Sleepers, ADP, and I'm fine with those guys in 2024. But none of those three guys, we've reached the end of the stretch of tight ends that I would consider to be every single week tight end ones, meaning what we were just talking about with quarterbacks, guys that we would put out every single week and not think twice about it. You're going to put Sam Laporta in your lineup, Travis Kelce in your lineup, Dalton Kincaid, Trey McBride, Mark Andrews, George Kittle, Evan Ingram even. All of those guys are guys that you're just going to put in your lineup. You're not going to think twice about it. Now, Brock Bowers, great as he is as a rookie, insane of a talent as he is as a rookie, are we confident that he is worth being in the lineup every single week? Should we have David Njoku in the lineup every single week? For me, I'm not there with any of those guys. Instead, I'm going to be passing on tight end. I'll grab tight ends later. I'll be streaming, once again, using the heat map. If you're not familiar with what that is, don't worry. I'll be showing it momentarily at some point, I'm sure. So if we're not drafting quarterback and we're not drafting tight end, that brings us back to running backs and wide receivers, which, to be clear, are the most important positions that you can draft in fantasy football. So when in doubt, grab another running back. When in doubt, grab another wide receiver. Now, from a roster construction standpoint, again, I invested the most expensive draft capital that I had at wide receiver. My very first 4 picks were wide receiver. Now at RB1, Alvin Kamara, we feel pretty confident that guy's going to be in the lineup every single week. Aaron Jones, that's a pretty solid second running back, but he might not be the best option for me at running back every single week. So what I want to do is I want to get a third running back, and moving forward, just play the matchups between Aaron Jones and Najee Harris and anybody else that are at the running back position to see who's going to fill in for that RB2 role. Now, in this case, the best remaining running backs are who we were talking about in the last round, which were Najee Harris and Zamir White. You could also talk about Jaylen Warren, but it's going to be one of those three. And for me, again, always feel free to come in here, click the note open, and read what we have written for any player that you're considering drafting. But for me, the TLDR, if I can take Najee Harris, who's the presumed RB1, in an Arthur Smith offense, we're talking about the run-heaviest offensive coordinator in all of football besides Jim Harbaugh and Greg Roman, give credit where it's due. Arthur Smith is the guy who wants to run the ball more than anybody in football. And if you're giving me Najee Harris on an improved offense that should score more points than they did last year, I'm mighty fine with Najee Harris as my third running back, especially after I've already locked and loaded with 4 straight wide receivers. For me, it's Najee Harris here. Alrighty, we are back on the clock in round 8. This is now officially pick number 91. Everything has worked out basically perfectly to this point. I was actually expecting at least one quarterback to go off the board, but not a single quarterback went off the board there. We still have our choice of Dak Prescott, Kyler Murray, and Jordan Love all available on the board here. And now, whereas the last round, right, we looked at the 6 teams that followed our selection, all 6 teams had at least one quarterback. If we do that again this round, now there's 5 teams that follow this selection. Each team gets 2 picks, so there's going to be 10 picks after this pick. 4 of those 5 teams do not have a quarterback. I can all but guarantee you that Dak Prescott, Kyler Murray, Jordan Love, maybe even Brock Purdy, every single one of those guys is about to come off the board. So if I want to get one of those every week QB1s, this is the time to do it. Now, the only other one that I would really truthfully consider here is Christian Watson, who is just falling way too far. This guy going in the 8th round is absolutely absurd. He usually goes in the early to mid 6th round of competitive best ball drafts, and we're looking at him in the middle of the 8th. So he should at least be on the radar. However, again, if you look at Sleeper's ADP, on Sleeper, apparently he usually goes around pick 102, which is very close to our next pick of 102. So there's a good chance that Christian Watson's going to be available. Now, even if he's available with the next pick, I'm not 100% sure we'll be taking him there. We'll see what's available on the board. But when you look at Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's draft guide, he's clearly the best wide receiver available. Like, he's in a tier of his own. And then we get right into the quarterbacks between Dak Prescott and Kyler Murray. Now, currently I have Kyler Murray ranked ahead of Dak Prescott, but if you listen to episode 19, or if you watched episode 19, I am all about Dak Prescott in 2024 fantasy football. I think he's a dark horse to win the MVP award in 2024. And as always, if you ever want to know why and what we're expecting from Dak Prescott in 2024 fantasy football, you can pop open his note, pop open his analysis, pop open his preview, just like we did right here on the screen. But in this case, we know Kyler won't be back. We know Dak won't be back. Jordan Love probably won't be back. Brock Purdy might not be back. We're going to scoop up our QB1, get Dak Prescott in the 8th round of this 12-team fantasy football draft. Hard to not feel good about that. All right, we are back on the clock in the 9th round. This is going to be pick number 102. And as predicted, quarterbacks flew off the board after we took Dak Prescott. We started a little bit of a QB run here. Immediately after Dak Prescott, the next 3 were quarterbacks. 4 of the next 5 picks were quarterbacks. We saw Kyler Murray, Jordan Love, Brock Purdy, and Caleb Williams even come off the board. So now we are back on the clock in the middle of the 9th round, and here are our options. First and foremost, quarterback. We're not even looking at quarterback for the rest of this draft. If this is a 1 quarterback league and I'm only starting 15, or I only have 15 roster spots, I want 1 quarterback and 1 quarterback only. The same goes for tight end, kicker, and defense. So now that I have my quarterback, I'm basically ignoring it. I almost don't even care who's available, regardless of who it is, regardless of who's available in the 15th. They're just not, it's a waste of a roster space, okay? So we're ignoring quarterback at this point. Now, running backs, the best available running backs, at least according to Sleeper's ADP, we're talking about guys like Trey Benson, Tyjae Spears, Brian Robinson, not necessarily guys that move the needle. At tight end, Dallas Goedert is the best available tight end, and that is also the same in Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's draft guide. We're looking at Dallas Goedert as the best possible tight end, and we still need a tight end. Candidly, if this was a best ball draft, and in a best ball draft, you can't add players, you can't drop players, you must draft multiple of every position, because there are no adds, drops, or waivers. So if this was a best ball draft, I would 100% be considering Dallas Goedert with this selection as my number 1 tight end. He's going to have some big weeks in that Philadelphia Eagles offense. However, this is not a best ball draft. This is a redraft where I have to set lineups every single week. I have to try and predict and figure out which weeks Dallas Goedert is going to go off versus which weeks he's probably going to have a down week. And because of that, he's a much more appetizing best ball pick where you know he's going to have big weeks, but he's going to be much more frustrating in redraft leagues. And if I know for a fact I'm not going to be starting Dallas Goedert every single week, and more likely than not, Dallas Goedert is not going to be the guy that's getting you 10 points at the tight end position every single week. He's probably going to frustrate fantasy managers that are forced to rely on him in 2024. I would rather pass on Goedert in this case and keep stacking up at those money-making positions of running back and wide receiver. Now, we talked about running back. None of these guys are needle movers. Trey Benson, Tyjae Spears, Brian Robinson, none of those guys really move the needle. They're not big-time difference makers, although Trey Benson carries some big-time upside if something happens to James Conner. Tyjae Spears should be standalone flex playable in PPR leagues specifically, and he could come into some bigger value if anything happens to Tony Pollard. But the fact that Christian Watson a guy that goes in the middle of the 6th round in competitive best ball drafts, a guy that we've seen insane upside. We've seen some mouth-watering upside from Christian Watson in the past. We know it exists. A guy that apparently has found the root cause of his hamstring issues and appears to be 100% full go in a high-powered Green Bay Packers offense that's trending in the right direction. This is a guy that's available in the middle of the 9th round. We need to stop that slide right here, right now. Now, best case scenario, we're going to be able to take Christian Watson and flip him. We're going to be able to trade him to a different team to upgrade at running back. Maybe we find a new tight end. Best case scenario, we're going to be able to move Christian Watson. Now, worst case scenario, something happens to Amon-Ra St. Brown, Chris Olave, Deebo Samuel, or Devontae Smith, or they hit their stretch of bye weeks. Christian Watson's a mighty fine fill-in for those guys. This is a no-brainer of a selection at this point. Christian Watson is in a tier of his own in Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's draft guide. I'm big time on the Packers offense, and we know the upside that Watson can bring to the table. He is the difference maker when you consider what is available on the draft board. He's going to be the pick here, and as for what to do with him, we'll cross that bridge when we get there. It's a great problem to have. All right, we're back on the clock in the 10th round, middle of the 10th. This is pick 115 overall. Now, at quarterback, we're ignoring it. It doesn't even matter who's available. Looks like it's Jaden Daniels, Justin Herbert. Doesn't matter. Dak Prescott's going to be our every week QB1. Now, we still don't have a tight end, and that's not going to change. I'm not going to force myself to draft TJ Hockenson, who, by the way, might not even be ready to start week 1. He might begin the season on the PUP list. I'm not going to force myself to draft Cole Kmet, a guy who's likely not going to have more targets than DJ Moore, Keenan Allen, or Rome Odunze. He might be 4th in line for targets in his own offense. I'm not going to force myself to draft Cole Kmet and put him in my lineup and force myself to take 5 points a week. I would much rather just stream that position and figure out matchups all week. I'll show you what I'm talking about in just a minute here. But that means our decision, once again, basically for the rest of this draft, by the way, is going to come down to running backs versus wide receivers. Now, we took Christian Watson with our last pick. That brought us to 5 wide receivers, and none of the wide receivers, even though the next 5 players in Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's draft guide are wide receivers, none of them especially move the needle in a way that tells me I must have this player. I can't let them fall any further, even though several of them are becoming steals at this point. What I would like to do is strengthen my running back room a little bit at this point. Now, currently what I'm going to do with my running backs is we can assume that Alvin Kamara is going to be locked in, and he's going to be in the lineup most weeks, but we still need a second option at running back. Now, some weeks that could be Aaron Jones, some weeks that could be Najee Harris. And what I'm going to do in this scenario, in this case, is I'm going to be playing matchups and manipulating matchups to put the best possible option in my RB2 spot every single week. And the way that I'm going to do that is using Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's heat map. Now, that's what you see here on the screen. Again, this is the tool that started this entire business. You can forget what you know about my Discord server, my draft guide. The heat map is it. Basement Brewed Fantasy Football is the heat map. The heat map is Basement Brewed Fantasy Football. This is what started the whole business. It blew up on Reddit. What I'm going to do every single week in this scenario is I'm going to come in and I'm going to search my 2 players, right? Najee Harris. I've colored them in pink just to make it easy to find them here. But Najee Harris, I'm going to click on his name, and what you're going to see pop up is a full breakdown of what to expect from Najee Harris in this upcoming game. In this case, this was week 14 of 2023. It's going to start with a team preview. It's going to start with the Pittsburgh Steelers. It's going to tell you everything you need to know about that upcoming game. Is it going to be a high-scoring game? Is it going to be a low-scoring game? Meaning, are there going to be a lot of touchdowns? Or is this not going to be a very high-scoring game? We're not going to see a lot of touchdowns, which has fantasy football implications. Are the Steelers going to win by a lot? Meaning, Najee Harris is going to get a ton of volume as they kill the clock in the second half. Are the Steelers going to lose by a lot? So the Steelers are going to have to abandon the run, put the ball in the air, and throw passes, basically scripting Najee Harris right out of the game. It's going to tell you how Najee Harris himself is trending, how he's been performing over the last several games. Is he separating from Jaylen Warren? Is he losing touches? Is he on the verge of losing his job to Jaylen Warren? It's going to start to tell you about the defense that he's going against. It's going to tell you about whether or not, in this case, they were playing against the Patriots last year. It's going to tell you how the Patriots have been performing against running backs. Specifically, it's going to tell you how the Patriots have been performing against running backs that are just like Najee Harris. So you're going to go through that information, and then you're going to look for Aaron Jones. And same exact thing. You are going to pop open Aaron Jones' note, and you're going to look, are the Packers going to win by a lot, lose by a lot? High-scoring game, low-scoring game? How has Aaron Jones been trending? Is he going to lose his job to A.J. Oh, no, Vikings. He's on the Vikings now. But the point is, you're going to come in and look at what to expect from Aaron Jones in this week, what to expect from Najee Harris, and it's going to help you conquer even the most impossible start-sit decision so that every single week you can feel good about, I made the right choice between Najee Harris and Aaron Jones every single week. Now, we're going to add a third running back to that mix, and that guy is going to be Chase Brown. Now, on his own come week one, Chase Brown's going to be on our bench. We're not going to be putting him in for Aaron Jones or Najee Harris. Chase Brown is one of those guys that will come into instant RB2 value if anything happens to Zach Moss, because he would instantly be the RB1 in a Joe Burrow high-powered offense. But the other appeal to Chase Brown is that there is a realistic world, a realistic scenario where at some point during the 2024 season, Chase Brown just leapfrogs Zach Moss on the depth chart. Zach Moss is far from a sure bet to be the Bengals RB1 for the entire season. So when you get this late in the draft, the double-digit rounds, you want to take those running backs that have upside if they're either able to A, leapfrog the guy in front of them, or B, would become an instant RB1, RB2 type with an injury in front of them. Chase Brown is one of those guys that fits the mold. We'd like to see him do more from a pass-catching standpoint, especially in a PPR league, but as far as being a number 4 running back and a bench stash, you could do a lot worse than Chase Brown at this spot. Keeping on that train of stockpiling running backs that could become big-time fantasy football assets, should anything happen to the guy in front of them, this pick is going to be an easy one. We're back on the clock, middle of the 11th round. Our pick is number 126. We're ignoring quarterback. We're basically ignoring tight end at this point. I'm going to maybe look at Pat Freiermuth as this draft continues. But right now, we are swimming in a sea of wide receivers and quarterbacks with one running back in the next few tiers. And speaking of running backs that would come into big-time value if something happened to the guy in front of them, Zach Charbonnet is currently the RB2 for the Seattle Seahawks. He was one of my favorite talents coming out of college last year. He was considered one of the better running back prospects. The Seahawks did spend a second-round draft pick on this guy, and he has the talent, he has the upside to, if anything happened to Kenneth Walker, Zach Charbonnet has the talent and the upside to offer legitimate RB1 potential, not just RB2. He'd be an instant volume-based RB2, but he has the talent and upside for more. This is a guy that could be an instant league-winning type of running back should anything happen to Kenneth Walker. That's the type of talent I want to stash on the bench, especially if RB is the role where we're trying to fill some gaps. So to me, it's Zach Charbonnet, and I don't even need to really think twice about this one. Staying on this train of upside running backs, this one's going to be, yet again, another easy selection. We're staring right at you, J.K. Dobbins, who, man, talk about a bummer of a story. This was one of my favorite prospects coming out of school couple years ago. We're talking like top 5 favorite rookies in that draft class, but man, he's just been worn down by injuries. But he did go with Greg Roman over to the LA Chargers. If you listen to episode 1 of Inside the 20, I talked at great length about running backs in the Jim Harbaugh and Greg Roman system. I mean, we're talking about a guy, Greg Roman, who's been an offensive coordinator for 10 years in the NFL, and he has never finished lower than 9th in the NFL in rushing attempts. They're going to run the ball as much as they possibly can. Their current options to do so are Gus Edwards, who loved the guy, but he's not necessarily this world-changing talent. They did draft rookie Keimani Vidal, but he is a 5th, 6th round rookie, I forget without having my numbers right in front of me. And then they have J.K. Dobbins, who's he's never ever been shy of upside. We just need the guy to stay on the field. And if we're talking 12th round flyers on a guy who could theoretically become the RB1 in a Greg Roman and Jim Harbaugh offense, that's a great stash to keep on the end of your bench. All right, so there are 3 picks left in this draft, and we still don't have a tight end, a kicker, or a defense. Now, I understand how not having a tight end in particular makes you feel queasy. I mean, that means we're dancing with the waiver wire each and every week during the season, and that's going to make a lot of you uncomfortable. Now, if you want to know something we could have done differently, right? We had an opportunity back here in round 4 where we took Devontae Smith. We could have used that pick on a Mark Andrews or a Dalton Kincaid. Likewise, in round 5 where we took Alvin Kamara, Dalton Kincaid was still available on the board. Round 6 where we took Aaron Jones, we could have went with Evan Ingram. Round 7 where we went with Najee Harris, we could have went with Jake Ferguson. Now, candidly, those are options that's something we could have done differently, and I won't argue anybody for doing any of those things. That said, if I were to do this draft all over again, I would not change a single thing. Candidly, I've loved how this thing has worked out. I understand that tight end feels really nauseating at this point, but let me show you exactly what I do in this scenario, because I do this every single year with great success per Borat, okay? We were talking earlier about the weekly heat map. Down in the bottom of the weekly heat map, this is in a Google sheet, by the way. So if you're familiar with Google Sheets or Excel spreadsheets, it all runs right through there. At the very bottom, there's a tab for streamers. And in the streamers tab, I offer up plug and play defenses, kickers, tight ends, and quarterbacks that you can plug right off the waiver wire and play right in your lineup each and every week. In week 14, I offered up Isaiah Likely, Taysom Hill, Cade Otton, Tyler Conklin, Gerald Everett, Donald Parham, and Brevin Jordan. These are guys who had data suggesting that it was possible they were going to have an above average week or a fantasy friendly type of week where they had an opportunity to finish inside the top 12 of fantasy football tight ends for that week. That was week 14. In week 15, it was Pat Freiermuth, Gerald Everett, Tucker Kraft, Chiga Okonkwo, Logan Thomas, Isaiah Likely. In week 16, it looked a little bit different. It was Juwan Johnson, Taysom Hill, who, by the way, if you're doing best ball drafts and Taysom Hill is listed as a tight end, do not leave your draft without Taysom Hill. That's all I'll say. Tyler Higbee, Pat Freiermuth, Dawson Knox, Kyle Pitts, Jonnu Smith, Hunter Henry, Isaiah Likely, Cade Otton. Every single week, I am offering up options that you can plug right off your waiver wire and play right in your lineup that has data to suggest, 30 plus hours of weekly research to suggest that this player has an opportunity to finish as one of fantasy's top tight ends that week. So that is why 300 plus fantasy football or Basement Brewed Fantasy Football subscribers don't sweat it when they don't have Travis Kelce or Sam Laporta or one of those every week tight ends. We'll figure it out as we go. Now, the week 1 heat map, that's coming. It's not quite ready yet. It's on the way. But I can already tell you, I just kind of ran the numbers. I kind of ran through my own tight end streamer formula. And I can tell you 3 of the names that are going to be on that list for week 1 right off the bat. And some of these are some deep streamers. First and foremost, we have Hunter Henry. Now, Hunter Henry is a proven commodity. Like, we've seen the upside that Hunter Henry can bring to the table. At one point, he looked like he was going to be one of the best tight ends in the league before he went over to New England. But the New England Patriots have an all-new coaching staff. It's a whole new era in New England, and they do not currently have a clear-cut wide receiver 1 or a number 1 option in the passing game. It could be their rookie Jalen Polk, could be Kendrick Bourne, could be Demario Douglas, who had a great year last year, but it also could be Hunter Henry. Hunter Henry could be a cheap source of targets for Jacoby Brissett or for Drake May, whoever's going to be starting football games over there. And now in week 1, the New England Patriots are going up against the Cincinnati Bengals. So what do we know about that? We know that the Cincinnati Bengals have Joe Burrow. That's going to be a really, really high-powered offense, especially at home. And it's very likely that the Cincinnati Bengals should put plenty of points on the board. The New England Patriots are more than likely going to be chasing points. They're more than likely going to be throwing the ball, trying to catch up to the Cincinnati Bengals. And what else do we know? Lo and behold, last year's Bengals gave up the second most PPR points per game to enemy tight ends. That's what you see right here. This number 2 on the heat map underneath tight ends and next to the Bengals, that's what indicates that the Bengals gave up the second most PPR points per game to opposing tight ends. So right off the bat, Hunter Henry is a pretty darn good option for a streamer for those of you in a pinch who need a streamer at tight end. We also have Tyler Conklin, who is now Aaron Rodgers' not new, but he's Aaron Rodgers' tight end number 1. The Jets are going to be going up against the San Francisco 49ers, who, not a very bad football team. This is likely going to be a high-scoring game. The Jets are going to have to throw the ball to keep up with San Francisco. Who's to say Tyler Conklin can't find the end zone? Last but not least, we have Jelani Woods. Now, Jelani Woods is the number 1 tight end for the Colts. Now, this is a pretty deep streaming option, but he's going to be the number 1 tight end for the Colts going against the Houston Texans, right? We're talking CJ Stroud, Stephon Diggs, Nico Collins, Tank Dell. We're talking about a high-powered offense where the Texans could put some points on the scoreboard. And if the Colts are forced to put the ball in the air to try and keep up with the Houston Texans, who's to say Jelani Woods can't get lucky once or twice against the Houston Texans, a team that last year allowed the 3rd most PPR points per game to opposing tight ends. So if you're in a pinch, I promise you there are going to be options at tight end that you're going to be able to grab right before week 1 begins, throw them into your lineup, and in this case, my favorite option is Hunter Henry. As for defenses and kickers, it's the exact same thing. It's the exact same strategy. Every week, I'm offering up weekly streamers that you can plug off of the waiver wire and play right in your lineup immediately. We're talking defenses, kickers, tight ends, and quarterbacks. Now, one of the biggest mistakes I see fantasy football players make with defenses and kickers is feeling like they must draft one. Unless your league forces you to select one, I usually don't. In fact, to rewind for 1 second, if this was me in a regular league and I'm not forced to choose a tight end, in this case, I wouldn't have even drafted Hunter Henry. I would have kept stacking up those upside art running backs and maybe another wide receiver. Same thing here. I wouldn't even touch defense. I wouldn't even touch kicker. And so 2 of the big mistakes that I see fantasy football players make here is, number 1, thinking they must pick a defense or a kicker. And that's possible. You might be in a league where you're forced to choose at least one of each position, or there's penalties for too many waivers, or you can only use so many waivers per week. All of that changes things. All of that changes my answer. But if there's no restrictions or there's no limits or no minimums of what you must do, I'm not even touching kicker. I'm not even touching defense. I'm stocking up guys that I can put on my injured reserve and just stash away. Or I'm stocking up more RB2 options, especially if I'm drafting in early August and if it's possible the guy in front of them gets hurt, suddenly I just lucked into an RB1. So right here in a real draft, I would not be touching defense. I would not be touching kicker. The other part of this is a lot of times fantasy football players inherently think, man, I got to get the best defense. As you can see here, the 49ers went in the 13th round, the Jets went in the 14th round, and I get it. Those are going to be great defenses. However, like we just talked about, the 49ers play Aaron Rodgers and the Jets. That's not something I would want for my defense, the 49ers. The Jets play Brock Purdy and Christian McCaffrey and the 49ers. That's not something I would want for my defense either. So in this case, week 1, again, I have not done the week 1 heat map yet, but I can all but guarantee you that the Seattle Seahawks are going to be the number 1 streaming option on my defensive streamers cheat sheet because they're going to be going against Jarrett Stidham in the Denver Broncos. We can guarantee that's going to be a low-scoring game, so they're not going to put a ton of points on the Seahawks defense, and it's always possible that Seattle is able to make Jarrett Stidham pay, hit them with sacks, get some interceptions. They're a great streaming option in week 1, and then every single week, we're going to keep updating that list and offering up a new streamer or dozens of new streamers every single week. Let's just grab the Seahawks here and assume that they're going to be our week 1 play. All right, and then last but not least, while this is wrapping up, it's going to be the exact same thing with kickers. I'm not even going to spend a ton of time here. The things that I'm looking for with kickers, and I actually write this in my heat map for everybody to understand, is every week I'm looking for kickers who have a Vegas implied total that suggests field goal. It suggests 2 things, a high score and field goals. So you'll see here, I grabbed week 15, for example. Jake Moody with the San Francisco 49ers. That week, the 49ers had an implied total of 30 points. I like that a lot because that implies That implies what? 3 touchdowns and extra points gets them to 21, and then another 3 field goals gets them to 30. 30 is a great number to target if you're looking for a kicker. 28, however, that's not such a great number to target because that implies just 4 extra points. But 26, 25, 26, those are numbers that imply that there will be field goals. Again, I have not done week 1 quite yet, so I'm literally just going to grab any kicker that's available in this list. Jason Sanders sounds great. So, to recap, after 15 rounds in a 12-team PPR league, we got Dak Prescott, who I believe is a dark horse to win MVP this year. He's going to be holding down our QB1 spot every single week. At running back, Alvin Kamara, who has 75-plus catches in 5 of 7 seasons in the NFL, he's going to be our RB1. He's going to be in our lineups most weeks. At RB2, we're going to be playing the matchup game between Aaron Jones, Najee Harris, and then we'll see what comes of Chase Brown, Zach Charbonnet, and J.K. Dobbins. Again, one thing that fantasy football players must keep in mind at all times is that the team you have right now is not the team you're going to have in week 5, 10, 15. Injuries are going to strike. Bye weeks are going to come around. Busts are going to happen. Players are going to come out of nowhere. All it takes is a little bit of savvy waiver wire maintenance, and you're going to continue to polish and shine this bad boy as the season goes on. Wide receiver, there's not a team in this league that is going to come even close to what we're going to do at wide receiver. Amon-Ra St. Brown, Chris Olave, Deebo Samuel, and Devontae Smith are going to be in the lineup every single week. And then we got Christian Watson, tons of upside, just hanging out on the bench waiting for bye weeks and or a pretty awesome piece that we can throw into a trade to try and upgrade at tight end or running back or whatever makes a ton of sense. Defense, kicker, and tight end, we're just going to stream every single week, again, using BBFF's weekly heat maps. All in all, feeling really, really good about this roster, especially if we can be savvy on the waiver. That's all for today's episode. My goodness, this one was absolutely exhausting. I can't believe this thing is up. This is like an hour and 15 minutes. Tanner, I am so sorry. Everybody, please give a round of applause to my amazing editor, producer, Tanner Dawson, dude. I can't thank you enough for all the work you put into this show, making it so dang awesome. And for each of you watching, thank you so much for watching. It really means a lot. We're watching this YouTube channel grow big time, and man, it's so cool to see. I can't thank you enough. You're helping a guy chase a childhood dream. Dreams coming true here, so thank you so much. Hopefully you found this helpful. Let me know in the comments below what you want to see in some future episodes. What I'd like to do with the next one is instead of a mock draft, I want to review some of your drafts. So send me your draft boards, send me your, draft scores, your draft settings, and just let me know what you want me to do in upcoming episodes, because I still haven't quite figured out what I want to do with the next few weeks before we get into week 1. But that's all for today's episode. I'll finally let you all go, but really, really, really thank you so much for tuning in. I'll see you on the fantasy football field, and I hope to see you in the basement, which is our Discord server, an online community of fantasy football players helping each other dominate. Cheers. This brew's for you.